Senior Director of very, very a little housekeeping. The slides will be provided. So just know that if you walk through the presentation, the other piece of housekeeping is the required statement, knowing just to explain a little bit about what we're doing here today. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on the state formula for funding public education. The department would like to remind you the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current PPP funding formula. Current PPP funding formula will remain in place until the funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. Public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and introduced in the future. Comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current one. Considering what should be funded in the formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in the funding formula. All committees, subcommittees, and members of the public will be free to communicate openly. Documents and records. Otherwise, all recommendations are submitted by committee, subcommittee. All recommendations also in the now that we have the disclaimer language, legal language out of the way. Again, thank you for being here today. We are looking forward to what I know will be a very good discussion about a topic that is really close to all of us, and especially work with your superintendents and others in the community to fund education. Sam and I are making our way across the state, having these smaller group meetings. We started on Tuesday morning in Jackson, and then in Martin, Wednesday, Cookville, and Cleveland. Today we are with you, and then Knoxville, and then Friday we will go to Pulaski and Dixon. So lots of good conversation, and looking forward to what this group will add to that conversation. So here's kind of how we'll spend our time. We will provide kind of some foundational information, really on what we're hearing on the discussions around the funding formula, just so you can get a sense of where the feedback is as we speak. Again, the comment period is still open, but it lets you know kind of what we're hearing in this conversation. I think that will be super helpful as we dig into that local contribution component of our how we'll spend the majority of the morning. We will talk, Dan will provide a local funding overview, but again, the majority of the time will be you working with the teams that are here today, and then sharing your feedback with us. That is really the most important part of this process, because you all bring a completely different set of feedback than we hear from other groups. So we really, really appreciate you being here. Absolutely know that that will be how we will move forward. I do want to kind of give the superintendent opportunity around the room to tell us who you brought today. I think it's important to know kind of what teams are here, but also what is kind of who you brought. So Steve, can we start with you?
Sure. Steve Starr, Greenville City Schools. I have our board chair, financial officer.
And it's okay, I'll just work back. That's the thing.
Beautiful county mayor, Barbara Beasley, and I brought Aaron Bailey, our finance director.
And what will be more?
I'm not the treasurer of Mayor Johnson County, and I have lived there as finance director.
Fantastic. August County. Thank you all for being here. Look back.
County, we got a board member I did with it, but you did it.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here. This morning, I'm the superintendent in Sullivan County. Joining me this morning is our board chairman, Randall Jones, also our honorable mayor of Sullivan County, Richard Neville, and Larry Bailey, who is our county finance director. Soon we'll be joined by one of our county commissioners, Amy Stan. Fantastic. Thank you all for being here.
Dear board, you can be a vice chair, hopefully you're meeting today. Remember, it's also our county about it.
Steve Arnett, Superintendent Johnson City Schools, have board chair, Kathy Hall, and finance officer.
Thank you all for being here.
Richard Finance Director, with that, Finance Director, Matt Middleton, board chair, West, Preston Collins, John.
Tracy McAbee, I have with me a board member, Danny Ward, with Park County.
One time, I have our board chair, Jim Welch, with me, our chief finance officer, David Fry, and our city manager, Chris McCoy.
Thank you all. I have the next year, we're going to be director of school, I have my last director, and Mark. Anyone, did I miss anything? Well, actually, there's lots of different roles, lots of different, really kind of what, we were talking about having this as a separate conversation. We began to talk about, hey, who needs to be in the room, who needs to be at the table. And so you all being here today is wonderful. And really what we were trying to think about is all of the different roles that this decision and this conversation impact very, very directly. And so really it is about trying to make sure that as we think about a new formula and what the state local contribution splits need to look like, we wanted to make sure that we had some carved out time specific to engage with this group. So I can't thank you enough for being here today. As we think live, everything that we do as a department, back to our larger goals around making sure every student has an excellent education and access to highly effective teachers and all of those supports to be college and career ready. The work that you do in your district, the work that Sam and I lead in the department, kind of in the background a little bit, but it is absolutely what makes everything else possible. When you think about state dollars, local dollars, federal dollars, all of that is what makes all of this possible for our students. So it is very important work to us. It's clearly important that you all chose to spend your morning here. You have my appreciation there. So with that, we had a couple folks who didn't tell us you are really listening. We'll start. Okay, with that, we're going to jump right in, and Jay was going to begin by providing kind of a summary of the feedback we've heard so far, and then we'll do a
So my name is Sam Pearson, the Deputy Commissioner of Operations at the department. I wanted to start by just reiterating my thanks. I know it is a big deal to take time out of your day for those of you who are in the school system to get away here at the end of the semester when I'm sure everything needs to be wrapped up and put into a bow before the break. And for those of you who serve as local officials, I know that you're eager to be here. I just want to acknowledge that signals a lot about your commitment to your education systems, and we appreciate it, and that your local communities appreciate it. And so thank you for that. Before I dive into this, I just want to zoom out a little bit and give a framing for what I want to go over with you today. When we talk about school funding, education funding, we talk about two different things that happen in that space. We talk about building a formula with a metaphor that will live on in infamy about school finance, right? Building the pie, what all goes into that? That's developing a total dollar figure that we want to use to fund public education. On the heels of that comes how does the state and local contribution split out, right? It's always been a shared responsibility, but what does that sharing look like? And that's the part of the conversation I want to get to today, because you, in your unique speech, have a lens on that we desperately need to get from you. That said, it's really hard to have that conversation without a little bit of foundation in what's happening on the funding formula side. So I'm going to spend a few minutes going over the funding formula piece of this, and I'm going to ask your grace to do that thing that you don't do in presentations and pivot really hard, so that we can really get around to this local equation here. So I'm going to spend a minute going over just what this is. So the conversation that is happening around the state right now, these 18 subcommittees representing different student interests, different lenses on education, the steering committee made up of legislators, the public comment that is open, is all about a pivot from what we have right now in the BEP, the Basic Education Program funding formula, as a resource-based model to a student-based model. We know that 33 base plus PC, 39 if you add in the hybrid group, are already doing student-based models. A lot of people have asked, what's this big difference? How does this really pan out? I think the easiest way to kind of pinpoint that is to provide a few examples, right? In a resource-based model like the BEP, we're trying to generate a resource. So you have 20 kindergarten students, you generate a resource of one teacher. And what the formula does is fund that one teacher. That's the lens of a resource-based model. For special education, you may have speech therapy for a kid. That generates 1/85th of a teacher, right? Somewhere in there. And even at the high end of our fed needs, you generate 1 to 8.5 ratio. Again, that's all through the lens of generating the resource that is the teacher. Versus saying, hey, here's what speech therapy actually costs. Like, that's actually what is necessary. How do we look at that lens and what's possible to fund from there and directly tie it to the student need? So we're taking out that kind of in-between step. Still generating dollars for a need, but instead of looking at it through the lens of a resource, connecting it directly to the student need. The other example that's come up a lot is technology. I don't know a director in this room who doesn't have a tech lead who is saying, you know, the BEP contains $40 million for technology as a resource. But how do we think about refreshing devices after a few years? How do we think about connectivity over that time? Those are things that you could pivot the lens on, from a $40 million investment in a resource that is technology, this big pot, to saying, what does an individual student need if we're going to stay one-to-one or move to one-to-one? What does that look like, not just in a single investment, but over time? That's what we're talking about when we say a student-based model. This is really small again, this information will be sent out in a day. But to give you a framing for what that looks like in action, it means that there's a base amount at the bottom of this pyramid that's an amount of funding allocated to each student, no matter where they are, no matter their unique characteristics. That phase should encompass all of the things that we believe are necessary for core of education. No matter where it is, same level. Move up to that next level and then the weight. So what does that differentiation of special education needs look like? What other indicators may warrant conversation about additional funding? And we'll get to a few examples that have come up from the public comment in a minute. Direct funding are targeted funds for specific programs. So think about your students who are in AP and dual credit coursework, or the ACT retake. A very direct fund for a direct purpose, and it ties to a direct student. And then outcomes. What might it look like to incentivize certain programs based on how the districts are best serving their kids? Okay, we'll talk about a few examples. This is the part I really want to highlight before we down this spot. This is the feedback that we have heard most resonating across the state. In general, when we talk about this new funding formula, districts should not receive less funding than they receive through the current year. More money. We got it. We understand that is the big first act. That has resonated anywhere and everywhere, right? And not new, let me acknowledge it. Because a lot of these things we all know have been true for a number of years. Maintaining flexibility for local district budgeting. And for those of you who are familiar with the PDP, you may have heard the line that it's a funding formula, not a spending plan. Nobody's talking about removing that flexibility, right? The opportunity for districts to get their funds and then make the decisions they need to make at the local level to best serve their students is still a core tenet of this conversation, right? There has not been a conversation about saying this is what it must be spent on because this is how it was generated. Third, ensure that whatever is currently funded outside of the PDP is included in the new formula. So I have a few points I want to make on this. There are a number of grants that the state supports, so not federal grants, but that are state-supported grants that live outside of the state funding formula. That means, for finance leads in the room, they are doing an additional administrative work in the state's grant management system and E-plan, filing a new budget, filing a new plan, doing reporting and reimbursement requests against that concept. Right? And these are things like coordinated school health, school safety grants, things that everyone in the state, with some exceptions on the coordinated school health piece, everyone's getting. So there's the push to move those things into the formula. Right? That's going to minimize administrative burden on districts. Now, a couple of key points here. That doesn't mean that the requirement of school safety go away. We still got to do emergency ops plans, we still have to run drills and maintain logs of those things. But instead of the dollar being tied to that activity, those dollars come to a district and go into that flexible pot. You decide what you need to do. Still got to meet those requirements, but you decide what is best needed for your district. Now, I'm going to go ahead and nip this one because it's been a popular question. I want to address it head on. This is not about a bait and switch. This isn't about saying we're going to take the 20 million that's invested in school safety, put it over here and say, hey, we invested more in public education. That is not at all the end. We will be completely transparent about what does and doesn't move into the formula. So I just want to acknowledge that on the front.
SRO grant,
So the SRO grant is one-time fund, but I think that becomes an important consideration when we get into some more discussion on that. What might need to go into the base, right? If we believe SROs are important to have in every school, that should be a consideration for the base. This last week is going to root a little bit more of the conversation for today. The local match component should be stable when it would be under the PDP for 3 to 5 years. So I'm a little bit of a number cruncher guy here, but this one's pretty straightforward in its logic. You all, representing the finances of your local community, how those decisions can be made, cannot have a robust, informed conversation about what local contribution should be until you have the actual numbers that play out. I get that. You can't commit to saying, well, we really believe the split should be 75-25 and then adjust it until you know what the numbers are. You can't commit your community to that. So I want to acknowledge that on the front end and tell you we are not asking you to do that. We'll get into that in a minute, but I just want to name that piece for you. A few just giving you some examples of what we're hearing from public comment and the subcommittee discussion so far. Items that are popular in the base. For those of you who follow education finance in Tennessee, these will look familiar to you. They've been bubbled up from the BEP review committee for a number of years now. Nurses at every school are at ratio. Favorite counselors and school psychologists. Their salaries and benefits remain a popular item too. One principal at every school. Covering this one as an opt-out is close to my heart. Flexibility for facility funding and deferred maintenance. You all know this. We have a lot of aging school buildings in this state. They require a lot to keep up and ready for kids to come into them. So these have all been things that people have talked about as being important to the state. I should also just note here, public comment is not over. This is an ongoing thing. This is just a snapshot in time of what we've been hearing so far. In the weights, a lot of the usual suspects or ones that we knew would come up have absolutely come up. economically disadvantaged and concentration of poverty. So with economically disadvantaged, we're looking at those direct certification students who may be receiving TANF or SNAP benefit in their family. But the concentration of poverty is a new thing that came up. And looking at, there's a difference when you have a large population of poverty in one school. So thinking about the difference of a Title I school versus not. Students with disabilities, English learners continue to come up. Rural was one we knew would be popular in the conversations, and it certainly has been, but sparsity was a new thing. We had not thought about that previously and bubbled up through this. So thinking about when you look at rural communities, some are rural and small towns, and some are rural spread out with 60 miles in between school buildings. Very different consideration for transportation costs, right? And making sure there's some acknowledgement of that. And then these topics evolve over time as well, fast-growing districts and charter enrollment. I do want to name some of the things that we thought we would hear that we have not heard as much thus far. We haven't heard as much about gifted students. We haven't heard as much about dyslexia. We haven't heard as much about small LEA sizes. This one, factors into that economies of scale. How do small districts achieve that? Or K2 small class size weight, right? It was shared yesterday that schools are facing challenges with their earliest learners after the pandemic that they've never seen before. That makes sense. Students have missed core developmental time, right? What does it look like to address that? We haven't heard as much about that in terms of putting it thus far. And again, it is far from closed. Just want to acknowledge where conversation is right now. Yes, sir.
Plan on charter enrollment.
Yeah, again, I don't think that there has been a defined definition playing out from it. What the conversations have been to date have been if a charter school that doesn't have the opportunity to leverage some of its own district-wide support, what does it look like to provide additional funding for that? But again, the top line bullet that, we can pull up that committee notes and delve into it more too.
So this is a funding formula for public schools and public charter schools.
Charter
So the public school, but the county that was enrolled in a charter, they would get more money than the public school.
potentially. That's where it goes. And again, this is just where conversations are right now. I don't want to all imply any of this it truly is. I think there have been a lot of conversations, and even I have had this reflection after each meeting. A lot of people are assuming that there is a formula baked in someone's desk. I'm telling you, as the guy who has that responsibility under his team, it is not. It truly is being built around the input that is coming in. So, trust me when I say that is not where we're seeing. Additional dollars. So, this kind of goes into that direct funding plot. Things that have received a lot of positive feedback. Financial literacy has been popular. Middle school CTE. For those of you who work with the federal Pearson grant, you'll know that it was recently extended down into middle school grade. What might it look like to invest additional state dollars in that? Innovative high school model. This was a grant program the state ran out of its federal relief fund that gained a lot of popularity. What would it look like to sustain that over time? Extended school year. Most of the conversation I've actually heard about this seems to focus on the summer programming rather than kind of the whole traditional notion of ESY. RTI, this is nothing new. I think everyone in this room has known that kind of thing. Right now, the funding formula looks at that as a district-wide allocation rather than thinking about it as a school-based program. And high-risk tutoring. Outcomes that have received some positive feedback, early to secondary opportunities, AP course completion, industry certs, work-based learning. You can pick up on the theme here. A lot of what is being surfaced in that outcome conversation is focused on post-secondary and workforce readiness. So before I totally shift from this, again, I just want to reiterate, this isn't close. This is far from done. So we want to encourage you and your stakeholder groups to be putting in that public comment. Every comment is read and shared with the respective subcommittees that it touches on and is rolled up and publicly available. All right, I'm going to do that pivot thing that I mentioned earlier. So give me a little bit of grace to do that hard pivot. I'm going to give a few quick overviews on the BEP and how it handles local contribution, and then kind of tie this up and tee it up for our conversation in our discussion. So, easy overview, and as it pertains to local match. For those of you who are not familiar with BEP in detail, this is our basic education program, and it is actually called basic education program. And it provides a basic level of funding. It includes 47 different components stretched across 4 different major categories. Now, I want to insert something real quick right now. A lot of people have asked, like, are we just trying to do something that is simple and straightforward and remove some of the complexity? I don't ever want it to be misconstrued that these conversations are about not trying to capture the unique needs of students, right? 47 different components are picking up on a lot of different things, but they're also not picking up on everything. There's time and a place to evaluate what can be done in that way. What I can say is that as one of the people who often has to explain BEP components to stakeholder groups, 47 different components across 4 different categories, all in different ways, makes it pretty hard to give a straightforward, clean explanation to a parent when they ask me about it. And I know that people in this room have had that experience as well. When we think about what does that mean for the shared cost, a couple of things that I want to acknowledge on the front end. First and foremost, education has always been a shared cost between state and local incentives. Always has. The BEP is a shared cost model. It always has. There's ratios that have shifted at times, tweaks have been made, but it has always been a shared cost responsibility model. And so oftentimes in this conversation, we'll hear the line said, the state should fully fund the BEP. But I just want to acknowledge to people is that the BEP itself is fully funded. It would be against the law for it not to be, right? I think that the issues people are really raising are one of 2 questions. Does it cover all of what education really costs to run? And do we like the split between the state and the locals, right? And that second question is what I want us to delve into a little bit today. But I just want to acknowledge that we've heard a lot of those comments made about the state should fully fund the BEP. The state does fully fund what is in the BEP. The question is, do we think that's the right amount in total? And do we feel that this cost split between local and the state is right? So I just want to be sure that we start with that frame, because I think we lose a little bit of the momentum of the conversation. That's just the BEP isn't fully funded, right? That would be against state law. So when we think about how the BEP works, each of those 4 categories I mentioned starts with a starting point split between the state and the local contribution. Our instructional salaries component starts at 70% state, 30% local. That ranges all the way down to 50-50 on our non-classroom component. From there, that split has been further adjusted for fiscal capacity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But at a top line level, that is trying to account for county's ability to contribute to their education system. And I am saying ability very intentionally. We'll come back around to that in a moment as well. But what that means is that for counties who have a higher ability to contribute, then that 70-30 may shift a little bit more towards the county level, right? It may be that the state puts in 65% of the instructional salaries component, the county puts in 35%. For counties who have less ability to pay, that shifts in the other direction. The state may pick up 75% of the instructional salaries component, and the county pick up 25%. That's what the fiscal capacity adjustment is doing. It's shifting that 70-30 split, that 50-50 split, whatever that starting split is, slightly one way or another based on local capacity. This part is about the basic of the things that I can put in front of the people who live and breathe this every day, right? The sources of local funds, gross majority are property taxes, and then each of you have your own unique combination, potentially of other additional tax bases that factor into what you have for local revenue. Fiscal capacity. So again, lots of financial models underneath, but at the top line level, it's attempting to capture the ability of the county to raise local taxes for education. I said I was very intentional about that term ability, and I was. It is not based on what is actually raised. I want to acknowledge that. I think sometimes that gets lost behind the scenes. It's based on the county's ability to raise taxes. So if we look at West Tennessee, Blue Oval City, and the Ford work coming to town, if that raises property values, then that's what gets considered in fiscal capacity, not whether or not the counties in that area actually raise their taxes. That is what fiscal capacity looks to do. The formula determines each county's ability based on average rates across the state. So it's a relative measure. Again, that's going to make sense when you think about it's ultimately being applied to adjusting the 70-30 split to the 50-50 split. It is determined at the county level, not at a district level. So I know we've got a few groups in here that are counties that have multiple systems active in, right? Again, this indicator is a county level indicator, not a district by district. And under the, there are two different fiscal capacity calculations currently used. One from TAPSR, which is the state entity, and one from CBER, which is based out of UT Knoxville. And so there's two different sources of expert reviews on what fiscal capacity means and looks like, and those are combined to come up with what is fiscal capacity for each county. All of this generates two very important numbers that your finance directors, both on the county side and on the school district side, will know very intimately well. The first is going to be the required local match. This is just the result of all that formula I just said. Once we get through the 70-30 split and the adjustment for fiscal capacity, what we get at the end is here's the state dollar that is coming, here's what you're required to put in from a local standpoint. That's your local required match. That is what is required based on the funding formula. Separately, and in a completely different part of state law, there's a maintenance of effort required. That one says, in brief, a county must put as much into its education systems this year as it did last year, with a few exceptions for declining enrollment that can be applied for. These are the two things that locals have to consider. A lot of counties and districts in the state put in way more money than their required local match, right? We know that. We know that as a true statement across the state. There are some who are right at that line for any number of reasons, any number of valid reasons. But these are the two numbers that get you considered at the end of the day. Where does this all lead us? So I'm going to try to connect some of these dots. I said at the beginning that as a number cruncher, but also just as a logical person, you cannot make these informed conversations and decisions about what should be the state and local contribution in that split until you have real numbers in front of you. Until you see how the new proposed formula, if and when it passes, plays out for your local community. You can't commit yourself to something that you don't know how it's going to play out. I understand that. So what we're hearing and where we are starting this proposal is to say, let's actually tackle these two things separately. There's urgency about getting a hold of state dollars. There's an appetite at the state level from the General Assembly and the Governor's Office to tackle this question of the funding formula. That's it, right? I think everyone in this room has probably seen pushes at it that didn't go far enough, pushes at it that didn't do anything because it just wasn't right. And then we all know there have also been legal challenges to the funding formulas as well. There's an appetite to try to tackle this and to tackle it fast. And I understand that apprehension about that. But there's a moment here to get more money into schools for kids. Separately, and what we are proposing is to say, let's actually take this state-local share conversation and give ourselves 12 months to see what plays out. And really have a more informed discussion when and if we actually have a formula that can be reacted to, and when we know the actual numbers that means for each of your communities. Take 12 months, determine what, if any, changes a new state or state-local sharing model could look like. I'm not projecting that means there are massive changes. It could be that it looks very similar to the way it does now. But it's an opportunity to surface, to dig in, right? I live and breathe in the spreadsheets of this stuff and still have to go back and reread what does CASR do different than secret when coming up with fiscal capacity. Time to engage in that meaty information to say, what would this look like moving forward? We heard really good feedback the other day about this. If you're going to fold in grants into the main funding formula, one of the considerations is that some of the state grants we have require a local match outside of the funding formula. Others do not. Fold in something that does not currently. That's the question, like, how does that adjust and tweak what we think about for a state local contribution? It's a really valid point. So what we would suggest, and this is where we want your feedback, is does it work to say, let's take 12 months from the time if a new formula passes, so that then we actually know concrete numbers that we're talking about, gone through the General Assembly, any other tweaks would have been made, and we can have a real conversation about it. People have asked, what would that look like if there were to be a bill on it? My hunch is that it would still include some language about the local contribution piece, but actually it helps dictate this timeline and on-ramp to a new process. Here's what that would mean. It would mean local districts may see more state dollars available to them in the relative immediate. But local communities would not have to contribute anything for at least 5 years. So again, breaking that apart, 1 year, let's come up with a decision point on a new, if any, local versus state sharing model. And then we still know it takes time to ramp those things. Even if there's no change to your net dollar contribution, I know that that's still a budgeting piece that has to happen, right? If there is change, there's considerations you have to have at the local level as well. So saying not just at the drop point of that 1 year mark, but then having an on-ramp after that to account for any potential changes up to 4 years. That's where we're starting this part of the conversation. What we're going to ask today, and we'll be kind of pivoting here to the discussion section, and I want to be really, really clear on this. We're not asking you to make a decision about using cost sharing. What we're asking is, does this proposal sound right as an initial starting point? And if we did go down this road, what would you need to make that a successful conversation? What kinds of things need to go into that? So while we want any feedback that you have on those first few slides on the funding formula, we welcome those. I want to try to direct people's attention to this local contribution question. That is why this group is uniquely convened today. You all are the ones who touched that part of this one. And your value input on the rest of the formula, we want to capture as well. But I want to try to encourage you in your conversations to get to this piece of what would you need on this local contribution question. Before I turn it back over to Eve, are there general questions I can answer? And I will say, just as a disclaimer, if they sound like they are good discussion items for the questions that Eve is going to pose, I'm going to defer you to that section. Yes, sir.
Not a question, but more today. Representative still here. You know, what all we're talking about is really important local funding enforcement. But I see this as a 60,000 foot level, and this is an economic development issue for the state of Tennessee. If we want to move the needle on economic development in this state, in our educational attainment, if we can't do that, we know have funding for state level. At that point, I think that's where it needs to start, and we can worry about the minutia later. But,
I appreciate it. I appreciate that lens on it. I don't ever want that to get lost. It's a big piece of the puzzle, right? You know, we've heard comments across the state about how education systems are the massive employers in areas, but they are also what attracts new business and new conversations. It's important for local communities. I very much appreciate that lens. Yes, sir.
so in talks that have a funding model, one of the things that I think needs to be considered in the formulation of whatever Tennessee does is that once whatever that base is established, that there be a COLA formula applied to it,
because what has happened in some other states is that once that base, because the formula didn't include COLA, is that the increase is shifted to the local level now to pick up because the state didn't ever increase that base.
Yep.
Over a period of time.
There's going to be some conversation section later, Director Morehouse, about considerations to flag it, and you brought that one up before. We've heard it, like the inflation factor. The BEP right now has inflation built in. They're not like, that's the question that's right. Other questions about just what happens now, groundwork before we get into your breakout.
Can you, charge schools additional percentage to the base funding? If the discussion, going back to what you said at the start of the conversation, is truly aimed at giving more to especially rural and schools that are definitely underfunded at the current time, how does the idea of waiting for giving an additional percentage to public services make how has that discussion gone up to this point and can you expand on it?
I haven't been in all of those particular subcommittee meetings. What I can tell you is a little bit about how that funding currently works under the BEP. Currently, charter schools receive the average per pupil funding amount that their district receives. So even if you thought there was kind of a clean one-to-one tie with the district in terms of special ed option funding that comes to the BEP or EL students, or at-risk students, those kind of lenses disappear when that money goes between the LEA and its charter schools. So I think that's probably the starting point impetus that has driven that part of the conversation. What that could look like in the future, again, I would absolutely defer to the subcommittees and what they come up with in that space. I think that consideration bubbles up too when all of this filters into the steering committee of legislators who will consider a lot about those relative weights and implications about how recommendations from one space would affect another space too. Other questions that you answered on that here? Not, I will turn it over to you, and I'm eager to hear the breakout conversation as well.
So I hope that I thought it was important when Sam and I were talking about this conversation specifically. Grounding of what's happening kind of in the development of the formula side to help us try to kind of dig into this state local contribution and split. And so as I shared in my intro comment, the majority of the time is really giving you all the opportunity to talk amongst yourselves, give us the feedback and the questions that we are going to try to have today. And so I frame it to say this: if we take this 12-month intensive period of time to do this thoughtfully and well, what would you need to do that? And I say that because ultimately you'll be the one charged with having this conversation with your stakeholder groups. And so I think about what else other than the amount, because we know. And that was really the challenge here is to say, you know, to have a meaningful conversation, we have to have the amount. Like we have to have that, and we're both very aware of that, as I'm sure you are as well. But in addition to that, I want you in your groups to talk to the following, and then we will have a moment for you to share that out, because I do think oftentimes, and this is based on the ones we've already done, there are things that another team might surface that will then prompt you to think about. And so when we think about what else would we need, how does the amount? One of the things that I was thinking about is, okay, you had to have three things. What would those top three things be? And then what data would be helpful to have at your fingertips so that when we come back in January, hopefully if things play out the way they're scheduled to play out right now, the subcommittees will continue their work. Ultimately, probably mid to late January, there's a proposal handed to the steering committee. So if we come back to you in late January, for example, We want to make sure that the follow-up is more kind of a work session where we have an amount and we have information so we can look at different models and how that can play out, kind of doing different strawman models, playing with those state and local percentages. So what data, in addition to the amount, would be helpful? Maybe that's something about how the BEP compares to that. Maybe it's something from different sizes of districts and how it impacts those. It could even be, historically, it could be local tax information. We've heard in a district that, yes, we have a wheel tax, but we're maxed out on that. So how are things like that being considered? Local information, state information, district information, what would be needed to help you inform the decision over the next 12 months. And then we'll do a little bit. Are there topics? It's like, look, we all need to understand tax and fever. Like, we hear those words, we know there are two models, we know it's 50-50, but what does that actually mean? Are there other topics? Are there other models? What other information would be helpful to inform the discussion, to inform the decision if we take 12 months to really dig deeply into this so that we feel good about we have the amount, we have the right information, we have the opportunity to basically hash it out and figure out what makes sense as it relates to split, as it relates to fiscal capacity. And so that's going to look very different in different districts across our state, based on size, based on configuration, based on having one district system versus we have a district in West Tennessee that has a county and 5 special school districts. That's going to look very, very different in a situation like that. So thinking about what other information you all would need. So here's my ask with your teams, and if you're here by yourself or one other person, feel free to circle up with another team. I would like you to take 15 to 20 minutes to have this conversation and be able to share with the group what these things are. Top 3 things, like no matter what, we have to have A, B, and C. Here's the other data that we need to do this well. So we can spend our time and take time with our teams to pull that so that when we come back, we're having kind of that deeper, the next level conversation about what this actually could look like. Again, if a proposal is presented to by the steering committee, to the general assembly, we have that kind of to ground this conversation. So that is the ask for you this morning. Any questions before I ask that we get started in those group steps? I think that's a great option and idea to push forward. And I think part of that, as Sam noted, if this goes forward to the General Assembly, there would be some type of language that details out this 12-month formula. It's probably something that should be considered. We've heard a couple of other suggestions and things like that to make sure that we have kind of some safety net language built in. And I think that would be one example of what would be a great recommendation to include in that. And I think we'll capture in our feedback, but certainly something that I think would be really beneficial to hear from others as well. Before we get started, and this is really just for you all to circle up, figure out your feedback from your context, and be ready to share it out. Some lucky person on your team will get to share that out with the group. But really, it's just about giving us feedback to inform our next step in what needs to be and should be a larger and longer process and conversation. Right. So I'll let you all get started with that, and we'll reconvene. We'll kind of watch the conversation. Apparently, I don't do very well in this part because it typically goes a little longer, but absolutely we'll leave time for the feedback. Director Morehouse mentioned some of those We're gonna take about 5 more minutes to wrap up, and then Bob will share out after that. All right, we're gonna break down the super right here. All right, everybody, if I can have your super, I don't like the microphone, let's try to talk really loud. I hope that you all found it helpful to have some time to talk about the things that are specific to your district, but there are also things that I'm sure you all could talk about. Yes, we definitely need to do that. Our goal now is to collect how they around Sam has as well. But really what we want is for each group to kind of share out. I'm going to be taking notes. Heather's taking notes. Sam's taking notes as well. And we're going to start as far as order and just work our way across. That'll give y'all a moment to figure out who the lucky sharing individual will be. Or this time, sorry, your group over there. You know, we just talked about some of the top tier plans that. I know you said there's nothing we don't know that this plan, but we do need to know. We do need to know the money. We talked about ways to maybe the options of sales tax, what that would be on it. That's not how to rule. And then maybe what other items will be included for new school health, safe school, just some of those items that we, I guess, need more information on. As far as that will be helpful again, most tax information, talk a little bit about that. And we just talked about things in our county that, I think those are great, things to know. I definitely think, as this goes forward, us knowing exactly, you all know exactly what is included in that base and what happens to those things that have been listed outside of the base. I think that is great. And then local tax information, any key topics, if you all come up with any topic that you all feel like we need a 101 or we need a deeper dive on X or Y, you can hear. Wonderful. Thank you all for your feedback. Or your time. Thank you, Nick.
We talked about the top three things, looking at, total amount of grants outside of the match requirements for the grant. All match, moving forward. We would hold on knowledge of what would be helpful to have a base amount in place, following other states, border states around us. Look at our overall funding formula. And well, it's how they get the local land first. They talked about the actual layer by county, chapter, receiver calculation. So we need to get those two local estimate of actually how is that calculation, what that's for each line. Education, looks like how it looks. I think one thing that different times of education funding, a lot of times recruiting. Definition of poverty changed a few years ago, and that's the final day. We have $5 billion. Extra five, almost away. There, which encapsulates a little bit of the extra things that the extra home. But not a lot of students that know college.
I do know that, right now, we've heard that in a whole of our other sessions about direct certification versus like the old free reduced lunch, and there are lots of families who are not on public assistance. That doesn't mean that they're, I think that is something that we've heard of. I appreciate you flagging that.
Particularly because of the rule, I mean, to your point. Because it's not automatic.
And another concern that because we have has been a bit of offset to improve. But not only intending our officers to go out on application to do that potentially. That goes this way. It's clear every year.
Gonna bring up something that probably was close by that, but I'm gonna bring it up, as well as another thing that you all need to be aware of that happens, and this is really about federal money generated for kids in poverty. Of course, it's based on census poverty, but in the non-census years, there is something called the American Community Survey. And of course, families are like, I don't know what that is, I'm not filling it out. That is how your poverty numbers get updated in the non-census years. And so, I know that our approach team talked to your federal, it's called the American Community Survey. And I do think that's another way just to make sure that in those as demographics continue to change, that is something that people just need to be aware of what it is and the importance of filling those things out in those year to year. And they're sent out kind of randomly, so making sure that I know they send them out to everyone, but they don't kind of go to every family every year. They kind of stagger that. So just to put that on your radar as well. Thank you for your feedback. Yes, sir.
Transportation. I think we're looking at transportation, transportation, special education, funding. Every
Really good suggestion there as well. I know we've heard a lot about some of those, and the slides suggested, but I think especially as we talk about, being college and career ready and knowing that, those programs oftentimes in the high school are 4-year programs, and that is underscores the importance of having them in our middle grade so that kids know, have access and exposure to something that they can jump into their freshman year versus missing that opportunity for really good feedback. I appreciate that. Are starting to that?
I don't know if I can read all that or not.
Maybe you just say echo when you said it before. Call out the things that you have heard.
Couple things, we need more information, tax information from our city. How they. We need some help too with us. Got a man on our guy.
We did hear that from other groups as well, to say that, if the, simply passes something that comes part of the point, comes part of the base, I think that we have certainly heard that. Thank you.
We talked about the environment. Big stands out as a lingering question. There was a lot of input. Town hall meeting started about. So I'll bring that back to the front and talk a little bit. We spread out. Doesn't always equate to a clean funding of your staff, and that includes our staff, which is but in the room is safety is a big concern at our high school. I'd bring that up to the top of the list. Transportation costs already been discussed. Roughly 500 square miles of the county that there's around 100 routes, transportation that costs automatically. County, city school splits. County systems that pay percentages. How is that going to be affected in this
got great relationships with both trustees that we collaborate with and share with. What does that look like? What's some of the questions we have?
Yeah, I think you flagged some good ones. The assistant principal, we had heard that kind of resoundingly across the state, especially knowing the demands of, operating the schools, but also evaluations and things of that nature. So I appreciate that reminder. And the transportation, clearly, that's one of the things that we talk about going with sparsity. That is certainly a consideration. I appreciate that. Thank you for those flags, and I think the SRO is one that I've heard, I think in every group we talked about SROs as well. Appreciate you starting that, and again, when I've heard that mentioned, I've heard it mentioned across the board, and I've heard it mentioned for middle and high, and so, again, it's important of your feedback to say, especially on the need for SROs, I think that would be this group. We'll just let you all clear remainder. We have a definition. What we're going to back to what they said about kids. Granted, how we keep education from not. And the really bottom line was how much is it's liberty here because we have so many districts here, so I have. Number 7. Question was. Is, when you come back to what can you provide, for data points? Certainly, we're going to take everything you will provide. When we're having to dig and when we're having to do, which we can, and we all know what our historical data is, our local tax information. But we'd love to have everything that you're going to provide us. I would say also thought. Okay, well, that we will do our best. I guess what I'm thinking is, as we think about what is the most important piece that we can bring to the table, and you just described your own history, but perhaps, we can think about it from, what does the data look like from the state legislature district, statewide, the strong states, we can probably, but I'd like to have some details. Okay, we'll be happy to share. And, I would just, there's only 2 minutes, anybody else.
I'll just mention to the standpoint of timeline on this. I think it's great that we're having the conversation. I think it's good that we're collecting data, continue with additional conversations. So let's don't rush it to get it on the docket for a vote. If that means that we need to continue having conversations, we bring it up again in 23. So it is. rush it to get something improved. Don't rush it and improve something that we have to take the back amendments to, but do it right.
Appreciate the feedback. I will say what Sam kind of echoed earlier is we know that things happen in time and there are opportunities that come. We're in that moment right now. I hear you, and I think that's part of why Sam and I and others are having conversations to really kind of extend this component, because I do think it deserves and needs, again, there are 18 committees working on the other part. We need to make sure that we are being thoughtful and thorough for this component. But I certainly want to just call out that, we feel like we're in a moment where we don't want to miss out on an opportunity for additional returning dollars to come to education. And that is the impetus behind part of this, but your comment is noted, and I think having a longer conversation, especially on this part, would be beneficial, and of course, something that we are very.
One more comment to the table. This
Yes,
comment will be
absolutely.
off the table. Relation to what you just said. I was talking about the process, this is a great process, and I think everybody for showing up. I'm assuming the process that you should have a safety committee. So that's what this is, but all those together, you're gonna come out with a proposal, or education proposal, for next general assembly. Bring it back to us before you make it general assembly.
We have heard that, and we will definitely ask that and make sure that is heard. That, of course, is not my decision to make, nor is it decision Sam, but certainly, as we continue to take all of this feedback, this is not, we've had that request several times, and I will absolutely assure you that I will.
Having been there and after vote on something that is a big issue. Maybe a midnight vote. I like it. I was representing, I like it. Those my folks know about this.
Thank you for that comment, that's a valid comment, and we will certainly.
No, I would echo what I've heard from members on the other committees. I think that even as the committees are operating, if there's a way for the other committees to know what's being discussed in there, that as these committees are happening, being able to know what's being discussed so that they have an idea if everybody's talking about the same thing, or if there's something that's happening in one committee that hasn't been thought about, that I think that to get to that point, I think you get to a greater chance of having something approved, satisfactory at the end, if the people know what's being talked about in those 18 committees, if everybody in those 18 committees knows that once the product is to the end, that's something that will digest. I just heard that talked about among superintendents that are on some of these different committees. And what was discussed.
I want to echo a couple of things on this, because we've got this request before about the summary digestible pieces out of the subcommittee. I do want to make sure everyone's aware, all of that is publicly posted, but I have just, that's 18 subcommittees meeting very frequently, so we'll definitely take that to kind of how do we get to a summary digest to make sure that gets figured out robustly. But if anyone's interested in watching 18 subcommittees, and we'll it's available for you, so I do want to make sure that people are aware of that.
That's why I'm like, I don't think
That's right, that's right, it's noted.
and I want to see some of the force coming out.
No, absolutely.
Exactly.
Valid feedback, and we'll definitely take that back.
Make sure you put the QRC code back up there, and people walk in.
Either way, text that to them.
And we're gonna echo a lot of what we heard in our process.
Yeah, I think so.
But there are a few things that we had a conversation about, one of the things that whenever we talk about union funding is, I say the same, so we want to make sure that the pie is not bigger and how much bigger that's going to be. And this is the winners and losers. And I know we talk about that, but the other part that we had quite a bit of conversation about was making sure that the state contribution, maintenance of effort, that having that state contribution doesn't allow municipalities or counties that make effort stagnant, so that over time, what actually happens is decreases or stays the same. So there is incentives for communities to invest in it. We'll talk about measuring outcomes, making sure what those outcomes are. They are relevant across the board. They're talking about readiness, et cetera. Making sure for the municipal system, making sure that our city is not penalized for active support education. We're in a unique position. I like to my Sullivan County Deck have 4 systems in their county. It's a small part of Johnson City is Sullivan County. And so we're usually missing 3 counties with that. And as we talk, this has become a very complicated discussion when we start adding things like open enrollment and how is that, are we going to start dealing with it? I think more people take this conversation about better off, on this big conversation and stuff when it gets so it's about how we're going to fund education and how we're going to make sure that, as Meredith said, economic development for the state is raising ourselves up.
Well, that was great feedback, and I think one of the things that I've been thinking about having for this time, so seeing that same slide about the outcomes, those are all post-secondary kind of outcomes, and so if there were going to be an outcome, thinking about what would that look like when elementary?
Or self-population.
Correct.
So many things that, and making sure that, again, there's an incentive to succeed. Punishment to be paid.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot to do to offer that those things before, and our concern is what the tax burden be on our local funding body. We also like to see the BP formula, the current formula rank in comparison to whatever we use to generate the funding formula, and we think it's important to see that for every district of the state, and that's there to highlight that information. And where you can, and I know it's going to be hard to not only the dollar amounts, but where it makes sense, maybe a percentage of increase or potentially a decrease in certain areas. Again, I know that may be a bit of a challenge. We're really unsure about taxers that other people have mentioned and how those at local state, that how that's calculated based on what the state funding portion is at the local. I'm not sure how that fits together either. So we should
Don't go back. There are lots of folks who, we have a few in the department that would agree with that, but it is definitely insanity. If you go back and refresh, it's certainly not too favor. Appreciate that feedback, very helpful.
So, it goes very well. I would say there's one there. Asking to see if you could give examples of previous tasker that tends to help, I know about all, that tends to help rural areas, secret into the help metropolitan areas. Explain that to the board to really understand, because that's a big mistake 20 years ago when they tried to bring secret in. About 60%, actually about 40%, we had to find give that back to people. So really explain how those help in certain.
That's a great slide. That's a really good slide. Yes, sir. course, as you all well know, our state accountability model is also federal law, and so part of that is, I absolutely think that what we try to do, and I know that as things have adjusted with definition of poverty, as you just described in direct services, we were trying to also make sure that from a funding and an accountability perspective, those things align. I think that we will absolutely kind of come back around to that definition of what we don't want is one set of definitions for this and a different set over here, but making sure that those are reflected across, the systems of funding and accountability. But absolutely, I think that would be something that will be the back end of this once we get to the end, but also any adjustments that are made, they make sure that even not just accountability, but in other parts of the law, that we take that part.
Thank you.
On this slide, and we're at time, so I want to just make sure and more how to mention this possibility. That was the other consideration. But I would also just ask for you all to think about, projecting into the future. The Haiti example, that is life changing for not just Haiti County, but for all of the counties around Haywood that are going to have some of that overflow population and industry and things that support such a large investment. So thinking about, as we have these discussions, as you all think back, think on other types of flags or feedback, thinking now but also in the future there. What we didn't get a chance to talk about, but I feel like it's just more procedural, is if we take this 12 months to do this, what does that structure look like? We're just talking about right now, we have these 18 subcommittees that are meeting all of the time. Is this, what is the right cadence? What is the right meeting type? And I think to me, just in the conversation, there's some things that we need to understand more about pastor and receiver that might be more informational versus like work sessions that are allowing us to run models and consider different things. And so what would that structure look like? Participants. I'm looking around, we all have been on large committees and small committees, figuring out like who needs to be there, who needs to be part of this group. And one thing I wish I put up there is how do we do, as you suggest, how do we keep people informed as to what's happening along the way? And so thinking about those feedback opportunities there. So these are things that we're still considering. But certainly would love your feedback if you have thoughts on, after today's discussion, like, wow, we really needed this person here or this group. Next step from here, a couple of things. This is the first, as I said, a conversation on this topic. So taking this conversation back, having other conversations, making sure that you're collecting input, and you all will get a survey that gives you another opportunity to like questions, but just give us other feedback that has hit you or that you maybe thought about on your way home or others bring up to you. And I really can't underscore the importance of you submitting that feedback directly. Certainly, I've taken 4 pages of this, as Sam has, and Heather is doing the same. But I think there are things within your context that I can't describe. And so when you have these unique things that you feel need to be considered, that is best described by you or your team. And I think that'll give us pieces that we will share with the subcommittee who are doing this important work, so that they have the context and they're not just getting as fast as I can write the comment down. So I would encourage you, I would encourage your stakeholders to send that feedback to TNEDU website. You will get the slide, but I am right now going to pop back to the QR code because that is how we will send out the deck for folks who are here today. With that, I just want to again truly appreciate the conversation the thought, the feedback, the fact that you are here, the fact that you set this out for 2 hours. My hope is that you will continue to be engaged and be willing to be engaged in what is a very, very important conversation, decision, model, the things that will impact education. So my thanks, Sam, as well. I'm sure him, but just really appreciate all that you all are doing. I wish you safe travels home and a very happy holiday.